Welcome, benvinguts, benvingudes. We are pleased to move in this conference, el trabajo en las plataformas digitales, un futuro justo, como las plataformas deshumanizan las condiciones laborales. This is part of a cycle, is there a future outside of metaverse? And I'm just giving this welcome to you in English to introduce Mr. Strujana Kata. We are pleased to have you here. I'm Dr. Luiz Peres from the Autonomous University of Barcelona. I am a lecturer at the Department of Journalism and Associate Research at the Institute of Communication. And we are pleased to receive Strujana Kata here. She has a very astonishing multidisciplinary background from economics to social change training. She got a BA in economics. Then she has 2 masters, one a master of social science by the social science of internet, sorry, and a master of philosophy in development studies. And nowadays, she is researcher at the Fair Work Project. And the Fair Work Project is, I would say, that one of the most interesting projects nowadays, trying to put together academic issues with social change. So the floor is yours, Strujana. Feel our warm welcome to you. And she is going to speak for around 30 minutes. Then we are going to establish a dialogue around more or less 10 minutes. And then we will receive your questions from the floor, as well as for the people who are following us by the internet. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so sorry that I'm going to be doing this in English. I wish that my Spanish was up to scratch for me to do it in Spanish, but I hope you'll forgive me that. Thank you for the introduction. I'm going to just get started and then jump right in. So today what I'm going to be talking about, is the Fair Work Project, like Luis said. My name is Strujana Kata. I'm a doctoral researcher at the Oxford Internet Institute in the University of Oxford, where I also work as a researcher at the Fair Work Project. In terms of my presentation structure, what I'll do is start with a little bit of background about working in the platform economy and some of its underlying conditions and problems. And that context is what has motivated and given rise to the Fair Work Project. So that I'll talk about that next and talk about the project itself, the approaches, the interventions, and the impacts that we've had so far. So here before you see a list of all of my colleagues who work on the Fair Work Project, which is almost 150 people from 29 countries of the world. So while I'm here in front of you today presenting, I'll be presenting the work and results of a truly inspiring collaboration from all of these folks, spanning several years. So I just wanted to acknowledge them. I'll start with a discussion about the platform economy, and maybe let's start with some definitions. When I talk about digital platform work, what I refer to is the relatively short-term matching between the supply of and demand for labor power that typically happens outside of the employment relationship, and that is mediated through a digital platform. So this is things like Uber driving and Glovo delivery drivers and people who work for Upwork and Amazon Mechanical Turk. All of these are examples of digital labor platforms. Many platform scholars tend to draw a distinction between 2 types of digital platform work. One is work that is done on geographically tethered or location-based platforms like Uber and Glovo, where the work is done in one specific place. And cloud work is work that can be done remotely via the internet from anywhere in the world. And that includes platforms like Upwork or TaskRabbit or Mechanical Turk. So why are we talking about the platform economy? The reason is that it's become an undeniable phenomenon. It's growing phenomenon. But we don't really know how big it is, but we do know that it's growing. The reason we don't know is that there's a lot of methodological and definitional issues when it comes to measuring the size of the platform economy across different sectors and contexts. But I've got some statistics here to indicate the trends that we're seeing. There's been a 5-fold rise in the number of active platforms around the world to almost 800 platform companies in 2020. In the last 5 years, the number of platform workers in the UK has doubled, and we're seeing a similar growth in the number of workers in other contexts as well. According to the European Commission's Collaborative Economy Survey, Spain has the highest volume of workers across the EU engaged in platform work. 18% of the working population in this country earns at least a little bit of income from the platform economy. So the trajectory is quite clear. The platform economy is not a marginal or temporary phenomenon in the labor market. There's been an increase in the numbers of people and platforms, and this model is encroaching on and coming to define ever more sectors of the economy. So where did it come from? And in its current articulation, is it a natural or inevitable state of affairs? Platform companies' rhetoric tends to frame the rise of the platform economy as resulting from two forces. First, they talk about the natural rise of digital opportunities coming from increased capacities of technology and internet connectivity. So in sum, they say that our current moment in history presents the right conditions in terms of digital capacity to create and use platforms. The second, they say that the natural demand for flexibility and flexible forms of work. So they basically frame themselves as responding to an external demand for flexibility in populations. We at Fair Work would like to reframe the scene a little bit. So when we talk about platforms, many of us tend to think that the defining characteristic has to do with the novel technologies used by these companies to mediate work. However, in actuality, there are a complex and interconnected set of preconditions that shape how the platform economy looks in different contexts. Platform scholars Jamie Woodcock and Mark Graham, in the book Introduction to the Gig Economy, they have traced out 9 different preconditions for the platform economy, which shape the possibilities for what platforms can do in different cities around the world. So these preconditions are not just technological factors like the app that platforms have and growing internet, but they also have social and political economic factors. For example, the histories of globalization and outsourcing have normalized flexible and precarious forms of labor contracting long before the platform economy. Again, the histories of gendered and racialized relationships of work have also contributed to the flexibilization of labor standards and the pervasion of discriminatory practices in the labor market. Across the industrialized world, as well as in other places of the world, we've seen declining worker power for many decades in the context of downward trends in the labor share of income, declining unionization rates, financial deregulation, and the erosion of workers' rights. All of these things sort of frame the platform economy, but these factors look very different from place to place. The thing to take away from this is that when we talk about the platform economy as one thing, what these preconditions and their specific articulation in different contexts mean is that there's actually many platform economies all over the world. That is, the experiences, the practices, the labor processes within platform economies are not homogeneous. In some contexts, we see robust labor protections, we see stronger worker power, and platforms in relation to that reaction to that may have to be forced to provide better pay and conditions to their workers, compared to other contexts where there are fewer institutional legal safeguards, and that might allow for platforms to adopt more exploitative practices. So I'm talking a lot about platforms, so let me just quickly define what I mean when I say a platform. In this case, I'm talking about a digital labor platform, which means it's a company that uses digital resources to mediate value-creating interactions between consumers of a service and the individual service-providing workers who produce that service. I should also note here, just briefly, that there's very many different diversity in the types of platforms. This is one schema that tries to differentiate the types of platforms based on how tied to a geographical location it is and how long the duration of work is. So if you look at traditional waged employment, you have a contract with one company for a long time, and you're based in one place doing it. On the other end of the spectrum, you've got things like Amazon Mechanical Turk, where the type of work you do for it could be for a few seconds, and you could be anywhere in the world, working for anyone, based anywhere else in the world. So this is kind of you can imagine the kind of diversity in the types of platforms when we think about these two types of axes. So my colleagues at Fair Work have done many years of research into the platform economy in many contexts across Africa, Asia, and Europe, interviewing and surveying many hundreds of platform workers. These are some of the precursor projects that came before the Fair Work project and which have informed it. So now that we have some sense of what platforms are and where the platform economy has come from, I will dive into our findings about platform work itself. Typically, the way the model works is that instead of an employment relationship, the platform presents itself as a simple intermediary between service-providing workers and the consumers who need that service. So they don't employ any workers usually, and they treat the worker like a small independent business. So in some cases, depending on what the platform actually does, the classification of workers as independent contractors is genuine, according to the law of the land. But in other cases, it's a case of misclassification. This is a very, very contentious issue, and as you all likely know, debates around clarifying employment relationships are happening across contexts, even here in Spain, which has been at the forefront of this debate, where the Supreme Court recently classified food delivery workers as employees here, and the context of the EU directive as well for platform work, which has been sent out to all the countries to ratify to try and create a presumption of employment in the platform economy. We at Fair Work basically are saying that irrespective of whether the classification as independent contractors is legitimate or not, the reality is that platform workers are not protected by a lot of rights that they would have had if they were employees. And in our research, we've of course found that there are a lot of benefits that accrue to platform workers. Most obviously, they have a job, they have an income that they might not have otherwise had, but also they have better flexibility than some traditional waged employment, and sometimes people perceive that they're more objectively managed in this type of work. But the thing is, we've also encountered a range of issues, which is what I want to talk about now. Given that workers are typically classified as independent contractors, platforms are under no obligation to pay them a minimum wage. It should be noted that platform workers typically have to cover their own costs, such as fuel, insurance, the cost of leasing and maintaining a vehicle, and so on. So after we account for work-related costs, a lot of people don't take home less than the minimum wage. And most workers just have to sign a contract with the platform and accept what they get. They have very limited power to negotiate those rates. Here, I've got a quote from a research participant in Nigeria who's talking about cloud work platforms. And they say how the planetary labor market for cloud work pits workers in different countries against each other, driving down rates. So the notion of low pay is something that transcends borders and there's lots of dependencies across different countries as well. Platform workers also spend a large amount of time searching and waiting for work, time that is not usually paid by platforms. Working time is a very big point of contention in legal cases about the platform economy for this reason. Platforms tend to define it as on-task time. So that would mean, for example, an Uber driver would be paid for the time they pick up a client to the time that they drop off the client. However, if you go to cities around the world, you'll see delivery drivers waiting outside of restaurants hoping to be assigned an order. You'll see Uber drivers waiting for rides. There's a lot of time spent in the day where they're available to be working. They're adding value to the platform by making themselves part of the labor force, but they're not being compensated for that time. This is also true for cloud work platforms. A 2020 Fair Work survey found that cloud workers spend an average of 16 hours per week looking for jobs. This is particularly the case for new workers who don't have an established profile, no ratings, and they find it much harder to prove to clients somewhere around the world that they're deserving of a chance to do that work. On cloud work platforms, the withholding of pay is also an issue. Sometimes cloud work platforms almost encourage clients to withhold the pay if they're not happy with the work that they have been given. So that's how they pitch their services to clients, is to say, you don't need to pay if you're not satisfied with this work. But in practice, what that means is a lot of workers do work and then they're not compensated for the work that they've already spent time doing. So these are some of the issues around getting paid when working in the platform economy. A lot of platform work is also inherently very risky. Delivery drivers weave in and out of traffic all day, and ride-hail drivers are frequently assaulted, whether it's by drunk passengers or through robberies. In cities around the world, there are many stories where you hear about drivers and workers getting murdered. It's a risk of the job because when anyone can get in your car or you're obliged to drive to any part of the city, it's a risky position to be in. Cleaning and care workers, who are usually women, also have significant risks associated with the work they do. Being a cleaner or a care worker usually entails going inside other people's homes, and there's obviously a lot of uncertainties around that. The last 2 years with the pandemic have only amplified a lot of these risks. Workers face a double precarity in the platform economy. The risk of illness by doing jobs that can't really be done in a socially distanced way, but at the same time, the financial risk of losing your livelihood without any safety net and no sick pay if you're struck down by the virus. Even for the more socially distanced cloud workers, there are significant health risks. Some of them have to work with disturbing, explicit, or violent content when they have to moderate content on social media platforms or other things, for example. And many of them have to work unsociable and unreasonable hours late at night because they're working for clients halfway across the world and need to service them in those time zones. So in a survey we did with African and Asian cloud workers, 57% of them told us that they lost sleep as a result of the work that they have to do. As I've already said briefly, the obvious problem is that a lot of platform workers are simply misclassified as independent workers, when really they should be employees because of how dependent they are on platforms. And if they were employees, they should be benefiting from protections that they would have received under employment law. But a related issue is that platform workers all over the world often sign contracts with platforms based in other countries. So, to give you one example, in South Africa, Uber was able to avoid a legal challenge from Uber drivers there who got deactivated by the platform. The court that they appealed to threw out their case, not because the workers didn't have a valid claim, but rather because it was against the wrong company. The South African Uber drivers had taken the claim against Uber South Africa, who onboarded them. But according to the judge, it should have been against Uber International Holdings BV, which is a company based in the Netherlands. So Uber runs this setup almost everywhere outside the US. Local branches of Uber supposedly only provide support functions, and Uber International is the company that actually contracts the workers. Because South African drivers are hardly going to go all the way to the Netherlands to take up a case, it gives Uber a certain kind of protection against any sort of ramifications in other contexts. And it allows them to continue classifying and deactivating workers however they see fit. Management is a problem in the platform economy as well. This links to the previous point. Because workers tend not to be employees, they tend not to have any due process when it comes to disciplinary or dismissal procedures. Workers who depend on a platform can be banned from the app if their star rating falls below a certain threshold. And there's a lot of research out there that shows that women and ethnic minorities tend to get worse scores and worse ratings. For example, here you see a screenshot of a task posted to a cloud work platform where the client specifically asks people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh not to bid on the task. Another discrimination risk comes from third-party technologies that platform companies use. For example, Uber uses Microsoft facial recognition software on its app to verify drivers' identification, asking drivers every few hours to submit new photos to ensure that it's really them who's using the app and that profile. But that software has been shown to have difficulty in accurately recognizing people with darker skin tones. So in some ways, there's other types of discriminations that get encoded into the app. Finally, there's a tendency towards individualization, where platform workers tend to have a structurally weak bargaining position. It's very difficult, though not impossible, to coordinate collective power. In earlier accounts, like a decade ago, researchers and others who work on labor organizing used to say that platform workers are not organizable at all because they're all so dispersed and they don't have a common workplace to create a collective identity. And many big unions didn't used to make the efforts to try to unionize platform workers. But that is changing, and unions or worker collectives are coming up across contexts to represent platform workers. However, most of the workers that we speak to in our research, even today, don't belong to any union, and it seems that unionization rates continue to be very low in the platform economy. So this is the context against which the Fair Work project has emerged. Fair Work is an action research project that's based at the Oxford Internet Institute and the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. Our core aim at Fair Work is to try to improve these conditions that we found in the platform economy, but around the world. Let me start by briefly summarizing what we do and our theory of change, and then I'll go into it in some depth. The project was conceived in 2018 to try and address the risks and harms that I've just described. So in 2018, Fair Work brought together platforms, workers, trade unions, regulators, and academics in meetings that were held at the International Labour Organization with the aim to try and set global principles for fair work in the platform economy. The result of those meetings were then revised at tripartite workshops in South Africa, India, and Germany. From this process, 5 core principles emerged relating to pay, conditions, contracts, management, and representation. Each of these principles outlines minimum labor standards relating to that area, responsive to the dangers found in the platform economy. The point of each of these principles is to set a benchmark of fair platform work for platforms, workers, customers, and policymakers. So using these principles through a global network of researchers, we evaluate working conditions at major platforms, both geographically tethered and cloud work platforms. We score them out of 10, and we put them on a comparative league table. We then use these scores and these league tables as a pressure point through various levers, like engaging with workers, platforms, workers' organizations, and policymakers. The aim here is to encourage fair work and discourage unfair work, and thereby improve working conditions globally. We do this in numerous different countries. Platforms like Uber, Glovo, they are not nationally bounded, and neither is this project. And to go into some more detail, we're currently operating in 29 countries across 5 continents, and the goal is to do this in 40 countries by the end of this year. Like I said, we're based at the Oxford Internet Institute and the WZB Berlin Social Science Center. But then in each of the 29 countries, we've got local research teams, typically based at universities. These are all of our collaborators that we've got so far. We've recently actually started a chapter of Fair Work Spain, partnering with a team in Madrid at the Complutense University of Madrid. Most of our funding for this whole project comes from the German development agency GIZ, which is the implementing agency of the German Federal Ministry of Economic Cooperation and Development. We've also received funding from various research councils, city governments, and so on. The Spanish Fair Work project will be funded by the union Comisiones Obreras, CCOO, though the research team will be based at the Complutense University of Madrid and will be independent of the union. So let me talk about these 5 principles in a little bit more detail. All of this is also available on our website if you want to have a closer look. I should also say that the principles that I'm discussing here are to do with geographically tethered platforms like Uber and Glovo, but we also do have a slightly different set of principles that are tailored to the risks and harms that workers face on cloud work platforms. This first principle of fair pay addresses the risks of low pay and unpaid labor that I was talking about. So fair practice here means that irrespective of their employment classification, all workers who work in the platform economy should be earning a decent income in their home jurisdiction after taking into account the costs that they've borne. So for each of these principles, there's 2 thresholds, which is what you see in red, that we assess the platforms against. There's a lower threshold and a higher one, and platforms can get 1 point for each of these thresholds if they meet them. So the lower threshold here for fair pay is that workers should be paid the minimum wage, local minimum wage. The higher one is that they should be paid the local living wage. The second principle is to do with fair conditions. This addresses the risks that platform workers face to their physical and mental well-being. Fair practice here means that platforms should have policies in place to protect workers from any risks arising from the processes of work. And the higher threshold is that platforms taking proactive measures, they should be taking proactive measures to protect and promote the health and safety of workers. The third principle is fair contracts. This addresses the risk that workers are misclassified as independent contractors and have limited access to employment protections. So fair contracting means that terms and conditions should be transparent, concise, and provided to workers in an accessible form. And if workers are genuinely self-employed, then the terms of service should be free of any clauses that unreasonably exclude liability on the part of the platform. So in this principle tries to sidestep the question of employment classification, which is being debated at courts all over the world, because the Fair Work Project at its core is premised on the fact that all workers, irrespective of classification, should be entitled to these basic minimum standards. The fourth principle is fair management, which addresses the risk that workers rarely have access to due process around disciplinary or dismissal procedures. So here it means, fair practice would mean that there should be a documented process through which workers can be heard, they can appeal decisions affecting them, and be informed of the reasons behind those decisions. There should be a clear channel of communication to workers involving how to appeal management decisions and deactivation. Any algorithms, if they're used, should be transparent and result in equitable outcomes across all workers. And there should be a documented policy that ensures equity in the way that workers are managed. So that all has to do with different ways that both automated and human management of workers takes place on the platform. The final fifth principle is to do with fair representation, which addresses the fact that workers have very little bargaining power and collective organizing is very challenging. So fair practice here means that platforms should provide a documented process through which worker voice can be expressed. Irrespective of their employment classification, workers should have the right to organize in collective bodies, and platforms should be prepared to cooperate and negotiate with them. So those are the 5 principles. Each of these principles and the thresholds under them have quite specific criteria, and much of the devil is in that detail. So I would encourage you to take a look at the website if you're interested in how each of these principles is operationalized in practice. Our principles are also not set in stone. They are an organic instrument, and we gradually evolve them over time as worker circumstances evolve, as the regulatory landscape evolves, and in dialogue with workers, unions, policymakers, and other stakeholders as we get feedback on how this process is working. So we have stakeholder consultations every year in each of the countries that we're working, and the feedback from those, what we find in our research and other channels, all informs how we change the principles. The 150 researchers that I listed earlier, anyone in the Fair Work network can propose a change to the Fair Work principles, and then we systematically debate and vote on those changes every year at this symposium that brings everybody together. So it's a very iterative process of dialogue through which we co-develop and continuously evolve these 5 principles. So what do we do with these principles? That's the next question. So we start with a round of desk research in every country that we're working in. We map the largest, most influential platforms. Then we do research on publicly available platform policies, terms and conditions, legal developments, and so on, trying to assess these platforms against those thresholds and principles that I just laid out. We then conduct interviews of 6 to 10 workers per platform. We are often asked why we don't use a representative sample. The reason is that this method is not intended to provide an ethnographic insight into working at that platform, but rather it's to triangulate what we find through the other sources of data and to confirm or deny whether platform policies that are on paper are really in place. The final data source is through engagements with platforms themselves, whom we reach out to and ask for them to provide information about their operations, about their business model, and as how it pertains to the Fair Work principles. The point of the project is obviously to try and get platforms to change their policies and to improve working conditions. So we engage with these platform managers throughout the year, throughout the scoring cycle, advising them on areas where they should be making changes, giving them examples of best practices that we found in other contexts that might be relevant, highlighting anonymized findings from the worker interviews, and so on. So we give platforms a chance to resubmit evidence after they make changes as well at the end of the scoring cycle. So then the final scores are collectively decided by the Fair Work team based on all of these forms of evidence. The scores are first assigned by the country team in that country, and then they undergo a systematic peer review process where researchers from the Oxford team and 2 reviewers from 2 other countries all examine the evidence and the decisions to identify if it all makes sense. So this is how the scoring system works. For each principles, the platform is awarded a maximum of 2 points, which then adds up to a maximum possible score of 10 points. I should mention here what a 0 and a 1 point would mean. We award a platform a point on a threshold if we have conclusive evidence that the Fair Work principle has been met. We are unable to award a point, that is, we give a 0 on a point, if there is evidence that they're doing something that's contrary to that threshold, or if we don't have enough evidence to conclusively award that point. So it both means no evidence as well as they're doing something wrong. These scores that we award, they're valid for 1 year, and then after that we start the whole process all over again and we do the whole scoring all over again. Here are a couple of recent scorecards to show you what it would look like after we go through this whole process. The first is for Gorillas, which is a grocery delivery service. It scored a 2 out of 10 in Germany in 2021. The second is for M4Jam, which is a micro-jobbing platform in South Africa, which scored 8 out of 10 in 2021. So once we score all of these platforms, we put them on a league table like this for that country, where you can see all the platform scores in a comparative fashion. So here you've got the platform country league tables for South Africa, India, and Germany in 2021. This is for the cloud work platforms, so which I haven't really talked about the principles, but the process and everything is the same exact thing. We've had 1 round of scoring so far last year, where we looked at 17 cloud work platforms around the world, and this is the league table that came out of that process. So we've been doing this for a few years now, so what have we achieved? That is the next section that I'd like to talk about. So in the last year, these are some of our impacts. We did 103 platform ratings in 9 countries. We triggered 21 policy changes at the platform policy changes. We expanded the project to 26 countries. Since then, it's become 29. This is a bunch of our media coverage, which you can find on our website. I'll talk a bit about the platform policy changes in a while, but I just want to also highlight some of our other work. Beyond the Fair Work scores, we've also been doing some other work, like we've been collating and developing resources for platform workers and workers' organizations to support them as they go about asserting their rights in a collective way. So for instance, we have a podcast that where we share stories about platform work in different contexts, stories of unionization, stories of just like different types of injustices and wins around the world. We maintain a list of unions and workers' associations that represent platform workers in different countries for people to create connections between them, for workers to refer to and go and find them. And we also have a directory of resources like wage calculators, organizing toolkits, etc., that workers can use in their day-to-day work. I won't go into too much detail with the different kinds of impacts in each country or anything, but just some highlights. We've had opportunities in various different contexts, including in Ecuador, to feed into legislation and policy-making processes. So we had an opportunity to present this to the Ecuadorian Congress, where they were debating what to do about platform economy. In India, the food delivery platform Swiggy, which has over 200,000 delivery workers around the country, made several policy changes after engagement with the FAWOC India team. So, like, some of them were that they simplified the terms and conditions, and they capped possible liability claims that they could have against workers. The India team, like the Ecuador team, has also fed into the development of legislation about the platform economy in India. In South Africa as well, there have been a lot of different platforms that have made changes. Notably, GetTod, the platform GetTod, converted their terms and conditions from being from the UK law to being under South African law. So workers in South Africa could then challenge them in courts in South Africa. And Sweep South released a public statement. Sweep the South is a domestic work platform. It released a public statement confirming that they were willing to engage in collective bargaining if workers were to form a union. Similarly, lots of different cloud work platforms have also been making a few changes. Click Workers clarified the dispute resolution process for workers. Jovoto told workers that if they were to refuse a job, it would not impact their future work opportunities, which was a fear that workers had. TranscribeMe now requires clients, which it's a transcription platform, it now requires clients to provide workers with the information about what the job's purpose is that they're told to work on. Notably, Workana has added a public policy that all jobs will be removed from the platform if they pay below the minimum wage in the worker's local jurisdiction. Workana also committed to sanctioning clients if discrimination against workers is uncovered. So I haven't gone into every single change, but this should give you an idea of some of the ways that we've been working with platforms to try to encourage them to codify good practices into policy, to institute anti-discrimination and minimum wage policies, to put out public statements of recognition of collective bargaining, and other types of changes that align with the FAWOC principles that I was previously talking about. We're also trying to expand our work in a few other ways. For instance, we've set up a team to try, within the FAWOC network, to try to be more flexible about the way that we do work. For example, by developing bespoke scores for platform companies around specific programs of advocacy with the purpose of creating more impact. So, for example, this allows us to score platforms in countries where we don't have a FAWOC team yet. The largest example of this kind of work is something that we're doing with Glovo. Glovo, the delivery company, has basically recently announced a courier's pledge, which is a set of policies that they have put out with a promise to extend social benefits for couriers across all the countries that they work, starting with Morocco and Georgia. And in developing this courier's pledge, they solicited our advice, and we had various inputs which informed the pledge. They also basically has indicated that they're open to being audited and held to account to their commitments by FAWOC. So in that, we've taken up an auditory role to assess Glovo in all of the markets that they operate against FAWOC principles. I should note that the pledge does fall short of the FAWOC principles in several ways, and this is not an endorsement of Glovo, but rather I'm just trying to describe this sort of auditory relationship that we've taken up with them. We're also in talks to enter a similar auditory agreement with Grab, which is a Singaporean super app that works in 12 different countries. We're also looking at conducting focused research and campaigns to address platform work challenges that are cross-cutting across countries and sectors. So things like we're looking at a a report on ride-hailing platforms in Nigeria and care work platforms in the Middle East, and translation and transcription platforms. So those are some other research we've got coming down the line. The final thing I want to tell you about is our pledge campaign. So with the Fair Work Pledge, what we do is we're seeking to engage with organizations, whether they're current users of platform labor or whether they would potentially use platform labor at some point. We want to partner with them to ask them to demonstrate their public commitment to fairer platform work. So how it works is that any organizations, from universities to governments to rating agencies, can become Fair Work supporters or partners. Supporters publicly endorse our work, make the platform scores that we release available to their staff or members. Partners go further by making a meaningful commitment to supporting fair platform work. For example, they could develop a guideline or policy on how platform labor would be used within the organization when carrying out work-related activities. So such a policy could encourage them to always use the better rated platform in any given sector. So this is the kind of instrument that we've developed to try and increase customer accountability at large organizations when it comes to how large platforms are used. Some 20 organizations have already signed this pledge, and I invite all of you to also have a look at it and join us if you're able. Yeah, that's all for now. Thanks very much, and I'm looking forward to hearing your thoughts and questions.
Thank you. Thank you, Surya. Thank you. Can you hear me? No. Thank you. It was quite invigorating and illuminating, and I have a lot of questions to do to you. Going to the most basically idea that you highlighted very briefly, if I realize correctly, under this platform economy, workers are paid for the time that they are effectively working. So if we were under a platform economy relation, so this time that I was listening you talk, so I would not be paid for that. And now that you are waiting to get a question, you would not be paid for that as well. So taking this as, kind of a bizarre comparison, but I think that you put, and the Fair Work put, the light on the shadows and the lights of this new economy. So just to start, is there a good opportunity for works under this new, platform economy?
Well, I don't want to be a naysayer. There's, of course, responsible and just ways to use some of these technologies that that have been developed in the last decade. And this is the whole point of the project, is to try and identify some of the ways that it's going wrong and some minimum labor standards that we can put into place to ensure that the ways that are being used are creating value for the workers that are using them. Nobody's getting exploited, and some of the benefits created can be more evenly distributed across the platform's many stakeholders. So currently a lot of it is like value expropriated from workers to the corporate platform without a lot of any protections to ensure that the risks and costs are being compensated for, or that they're being paid fairly for their time, or anything like that. So definitely it's possible, it's not impossible. In fact, there's a lot of radical ways that people are using platform technologies. It's not really one category of technology, but that's the algorithms and the apps. All of these things are being used, developed in open source ways, are being used by platform cooperatives to develop local decentralized alternatives to these large corporate giants. And to some of these platforms that we have rated are also changing their mechanisms to ensure that there's minimum fairness is met on their platforms. So it's definitely a step in the right direction.
So it's less. It would be less a matter of the platforms itself as a model, and more a question of the economic model that sustained or that gave the the shape of these big corps use of platform, isn't that?
Yes, absolutely. I think the point is that we often end up thinking about, we're focused on the technological aspects of the platform economy. We think about it as these novel apps or these digital technologies that use the internet that connect people from around the world. And we forget that we've been doing work and we've been thinking about work for many centuries. We've developed protections, hard-fought protections. We've got them in place to try and protect workers who are engaging in these processes. Just because we're using an app now, that does not mean that it stops being work. It continues to be a social and political economic phenomenon, rooted in labor markets, rooted in the same, we need to have the same purchasing power to go home and pay rent and buy food. So the same rules would apply to the platform economy that apply to any other types of work.
And going deeper in this point, you mentioned that during the pandemic, we're still in a kind of pandemic environment, but seems that we are seeing the light in the end of this whole process. But you mentioned that platform workers were most vulnerable. I don't know if it's exactly the word that you used. Are the platforms work in general more vulnerable than workers in general? If so, why? Why we can say that? Yeah, under the platform economy, workers are more vulnerable by, I don't know, which reasons?
That's a great question. I wouldn't say that they're necessarily more vulnerable than all non-platform work. There's definitely other forms of marginal sectors of the economy, low-income sectors of the economy, where we find similar practices that are exploitative, where the arm of the regulatory arm has not quite reached to ensure that fairness and protections are in place. The platform economy is a relatively new phenomenon. It's not new, but it's new in terms of the technologies that are being used. So there's a little bit of a opportunity for experimentation to expand the capitalist frontier here. So companies just kind of are able to use the rhetoric to say, we are only technology companies, we're not, this work and employment is not our business. We are actually just here creating an app to try and connect these people that didn't know each other, but now with our help, they can help each other out. But that's obviously not what they're doing. They exert a lot of power over their interaction, and they need to be held to account for that power. So because they're able to use this rhetoric, and they've done it with great effect, like all of us, to some extent, buy into the flexibility narratives of platforms. Even workers often do feel like they're their own boss. It's very flexible, but when you dig down deeper into it, there's a lot of ways that the app structures their life and their day, and the own boss rhetoric is maybe not as clear-cut as it seems on first go. So I think, it's just it's a new frontier. So there's many different people are placing claims on the sort of discursive landscape of that frontier, and in that way, you're able to not be held to account. But that's what we're all here trying to do, is to shine light on the power unevenness and hold them to account.
And this kind of cynical approach from apps companies saying that, okay, I'm not an employer and so on. But during the pandemic, we have in Spain some case, and in the US similar case, companies were requested to offer, masks or gloves or among others, protections to the workers that are not workers from their companies. And at first they didn't. And when they were criticized by the media and exposed in social media, they started to do so. But they did in a kind of weird situation. There was one place far away from the place that the worker were based, that there was the distribution point and so on. So how collaborative are the platform companies with this commitment that you are proposing to change, you know, these inequalities and the injustice behind it?
That's a really good question. In terms of what you had just mentioned about the platforms being very reticent to extend protections and benefits during the pandemic, it was very interesting to see, actually, because you're right, it evolved quite significantly over the course of the pandemic, where at the beginning they were very unwilling to provide anything. And then upon a lot of scrutiny, they were kind of forced into a bad PR light, and then ended up having to extend a lot of protections. Several companies, I think it was Uber, maybe, I'm not sure about this, but specifically said this extension of these benefits does not equate to a reclassification of as employees, you know. So like they were the reason that companies are often very unwilling to be seen as being responsible for workers is that it might lend credence to the argument that people are trying to make in court, that these companies are actually more like employers and less like, you know, just people contracting workers. So they're very careful about how they are going to appear, and which is why providing masks in the pandemic came a lot later than it should have done because of this very reason. But you know, they're right. The reason that everybody, the media and researchers and activists, all ask these platforms to be the ones to provide the masks is because they are the ones with the power here. Nobody else has access to these workers. Nobody else is forcing these workers to go out into the street to do this. So at the same time, it does kind of, the narrative that they were afraid of is coming to play. Like that, you know, they are seen to be having this power. So it was actually a very interesting moment where we were all collectively forced them to, you know, be accountable in some way, and they did act accountably after, not too accountably. There were many shortcomings in the way that they did this, like you pointed out, but it was an interesting turn in the platform economy. In terms of our own project, and what you asked about how willing are they to come to the table, I think the way that the project is designed is to not necessarily give them too much choice in the matter. We sort of identify which platforms we're going to score based on which platforms are the biggest, have like the most workers in that particular context, would make sense for us to be examining their policies, and whether they cooperate with us, whether they provide evidence or not, it doesn't matter. We're still going to be scoring them using the evidence that we are able to find from the workers, from desk research. We're usually able to identify the contract that workers have, and that is a very rich document that has a lot of information about the pay, the conditions of work, the responsibilities of the two parties, so it can address a lot of the questions that we're trying to ask in the Fair Work approach. So in some cases, they're not willing. Usually, after we do a year's research, the next year, more platforms are willing because they see that we've got these scores out here, we're not going away, and there is, they have a PR kind of value to participating and being seen to participate and cooperate with this. So it's a little bit of a carrot and stick situation, but over time, we've seen more and more platforms come to be they're seeing sort of the writing on the wall, basically. Like, it's coming clear. We all care about this. This is not going away. We're all realizing that they're not just tech companies. That's not going to fly anymore. So they're definitely coming to the table more and more. And
thinking about, you know, these complex relation with platforms and the carrot and stick relations, I'm wondering to hear about the workers. I don't know, do you have data from the workers of these big platforms, Wheels? Do they want to be part of a union, or do they want to be self-employees? Or I know that you have a global research, but do you have data from these perceptions from the ground?
It's kind of hard to generalize because they all work in different platforms. We only talk to 6 to 10 workers per platform. We hear a range of kind of feelings about this. I don't think that it's not all workers don't want to be part of a union necessarily. There are negative views about what could this do? What if I get deactivated? If I'm seen to be causing trouble for the platform, which has happened in many cases. Platforms have deactivated workers that have gone on strike in some contexts, and things like that do happen. So it's not an unfounded fear. In other cases, people don't see the value in a union, and I mean that's up to labor organizers and unions and activists to show that there is value to collectivizing, to show that the promise of solidarity is not over. There is still a lot to be gained from that. I'm sorry, what was the other question you asked about workers' feelings?
Do they want to be part of these unions, or if they prefer to be self-employees and the idea of self-entrepreneur in a kind of social economy, being I'm the employer of myself and so on?
So that's definitely actually a very kind of visible divide among people, because like I was saying, platform companies tend to deploy these narratives of flexibility and autonomy to great effect, right? So workers themselves, a lot of workers do feel that they want to be their own boss, and they want flexible arrangements because they have kids, they have things to do in their time, and they want to be able to work around that. Other workers feel at the same time that this is a lie, and I want protections if I'm going to be out here risking my life on the streets. I think the point of the Fair Work Project is basically that flexibility and protections are not mutually incompatible. You can definitely have the same working arrangement, the same app, the same ability to allocate workers, for workers to choose their time and to allocate them while providing them with minimum wages, while giving them social protection, all of these things are definitely not at all mutually incompatible. I think the problem with perhaps asking workers if they want to be self-employed or do they want to be employees is going about it a bit in the wrong way, because we're doing it on the platform's terms, where the platforms have been claiming that if you want to be employed, you can't have all of these you can't have flexibility and you can't have all of this. But that's not, there's really nothing to that sentence, there's really nothing to that claim. You can definitely have both. So that's, I think, what we should all be pushing for.
Yeah, in this sense, one claim that these big platforms, so we are thinking about, Uber, Glovo, Gorillas, these big Amazon, I don't know, big platforms, they claim that their business model they would not be sustainable without this kind of relations with work. Is this true?
Absolutely not. I can't think of a single reason as to why that would be true, but it is something that they've said with a lot of emphasis, and again and again and again, it does stick in our collective minds. But why? There's nothing that prevents this technological interface from working with labor protections. These are not contradictory things. Would you not say?
No, I'm totally agree with you. But very often we heard these arguments, and through the media as well, and opinion makers, and from the idea that these two issues are not compatible. You can't have both. You need to choose one or other. And what you're saying is that they can fit, but we need to do things that we are doing in a different way, isn't it?
Exactly, that's what I'm saying. I think if you look at, for instance, the Deliveroo was doing an IPO registration in the UK, and in their document there, and in other papers that Uber has released, they often just come out into the open and say, if workers are reclassified as employees, this is a huge risk to our business model. The reason is that a lot of these companies have been operating in the black for a long time. They're making losses. Their entire model is based on VC funding, and an eventual hope that the massive amounts of data that they're collecting can be put to some good use, will become profitable at some point. So providing labor protections is a very costly endeavor for platforms. However, that does not mean that they shouldn't be doing this, because that is the minimum standards that we expect in any other kind of work. So it's also something that we should be expecting of them here. And their bottom line should be able to survive. Otherwise, it's just not a good business.
So taking the idea that we are with something new, that it's part, and we need to understand and to move forward. In some countries, you mentioned UK, and you mentioned one very new initiative, a fresh initiative, but some countries decided very recently to create their own public platforms, such as in the past, countries, they have their own oil companies, or telecom companies, water company, or I don't know. So how do you see these initiatives of countries that are saying, okay, so the reason the way to try to fix these asymmetries and injustice on the labor market is to create our own platforms, a public platform from a local city for mobility or whatever. Is this a good way to try to change things? I don't know.
I personally think it kind of comes down to the detail. At its face value, it sounds like a great idea, but I think it would come down to the accountability of whomever is running it. If it's the government, then the accountability of the government to its citizenry, for people to be able to, what are the kind of data rights that they have over whatever data is feeding into that project? Is there collective ownership, so democratic ownership of the people who are working for it, as well as the people who are using it, who's making the decisions? All of the same questions that we're asking of these private companies, we would just want to ask of these other enterprises as well. So that's also part of the Fair Work project, is that nowhere have we said it's a private company. We also we've evaluated platform cooperatives in the past. We can use the same principles to different types of organizations, because ultimately what it comes down to is the basic labor standards, and that's all that these Fair Work principles are. So I think that sounds like a great idea, but I think it will come down to how it's being run and to whom, for whose benefit.
Which means that we need to be more creative instead of use, traditional economic models or ideas from the past to offer solutions for a new environment, economic environment. And thinking on it, one important issue on the political economy of platforms is the asymmetries globally, from north and south. These platforms economy, and from the global studies that you are carrying out, is that clear that there are asymmetries in the global north compared with the global south, or this is irrelevant? It's a global phenomenon, and injustice is all over the globe.
To some extent, we're finding that the platform model has gone to every geography, and almost it's going to more and more economic sectors. The kind of core problems that we're going to solve are going to be mirrored across them, but the contexts within which these platforms are operating are obviously vastly different. So the fact that in Spain and in the EU more broadly, we've got the Writers' Law, and we've got a lot of different kinds of data sovereignty, digital sovereignty and data rights, and other kinds of policies that are being implemented and being workshopped and being developed, is not necessarily what we're going to see in every country of the world. There is more and more kind of regulatory discussions happening around the platform economy, but many countries are not yet having that discussion. So the fact is that eventually there might be a case where we have, for example, we've got the GDPR here, but then other countries don't really have data protection regulations, and companies are free to do whatever data practices they have. They're not necessarily required to change them. So we could potentially see a little bit of a divide in terms of how the platform economy looks in places like the EU and in other places. When it comes to cloud work, it's harder to regulate because it transcends borders. And in a lot of ways, yeah, there's just like which government is going to be responsible for regulating a platform is very hard to determine. A trend that we've seen is that a lot of like clients or customers on cloud work platforms tend to be in the global north, whereas a lot of the workers tend to be in the global south. Some ways cloud work platforms have opened up some opportunities for work in the global south. But of course, all of the problems that we've identified continue to, plague them just as well as anybody else in the global north, you know?
And trying to find out these general divides on the platform economy, in the global platform economy, can we talk about gender? Is gender a topic that we should look carefully, or intersectionality? There are other intersectionalities that are more important. How are you framing these on your research?
No, absolutely. Like gender and race and migration are all extremely important analytical categories when it comes to the platform economy. But it's of course very important to be very contextually specific when we talk about them, and it's hard to draw generalizations. With gender, for example, I think the most visible forms of platform work, which is delivery work and ride-hailing work, are extremely male-dominated. And I think in some ways have been the few women who do work in these sectors have to navigate a very male-dominated sector, have to use navigate public spaces at times of the day that might not be the most safe, to areas of the city that might not be the most safe. So platforms can be gender responsive in the way that they design their platforms to create choices for workers to ensure that they use the platform in a way that makes the most sense for them. It's not always designed that way. Most platforms aren't, but like some platforms are thinking about how to create more friendly apps for women and, well, not for women. And but at the same time, there's clunky approaches to doing this. Like there's a platform in India, a delivery platform that decided that the way to keep women safe on the platform was to log off all women at 6 p.m. in the evening, which doesn't really make the most sense, because that basically means that women are locked out of like earning opportunities for the dinner rush, which is like a very important time to earn money on the platform. So there's definitely, we just need to listen to workers and hear what they say and then go from there. With racialized minorities as well, like what I mentioned about the facial recognition app, there's just different ways that discrimination gets encoded into this, and the way that clients interact with workers. Obviously, also, we're all part of the same society. Inequalities and discrimination and abuse that we see in other parts of non-platform society will come onto platform society as well. And the platform companies need to kind of design their platforms to make sense for everybody who's both using it as a consumer as well as a client.
So I would spend the whole night talking and making questions here, but I think that we, to be more democratic and trying to be more fair, we should open the questions to the floor. So I think that we have a question here. Podeu fer les qüestions en català, castellà, i nosaltres utilitzem una plataforma per traduir.
I can put this on.
Gràcies pel que hem sentit.
Just one second. Només un moment que posarà la traducció, i ara la nostra plataforma, en John, que està allà, farà el switch i cobrarà el mateix.
Molt bé, gràcies.
Doncs endavant, sisplau.
Tot el que hem sentit...
A veure...
Sorry.
Yeah. So,
sí?
Thank you.
Ara sí, no?
Ara sí. Endavant, sisplau.
Gràcies pel que has dit. Però jo volia fer una pregunta des de fora, com a espectadora d'aquestes plataformes, perquè a vegades, sobretot després de la pandèmia, a vegades veiem massa consum de gent que compra a través d'Amazon o que compra a través de Globo d'una forma exagerada, i jo de vegades em pregunto, suposo que més gent, no? Si hi ha aquesta necessitat realment social perquè quan veig tanta bossa de cartró i tant cartró d'Amazon, jo visc en un edifici de 100 veïns, aquí, molt a prop d'aquí, i la meitat poden sortir de casa sense cap problema, més de la meitat, però compren per Amazon. I aleshores ja, quan baixo, hi ha un munt de cartró. Aleshores jo em pregunto, tant parlar de sostenibilitat, per què no hi ha un punt mig i es fan servir aquestes plataformes quan realment siguin oportunes, necessàries, per gent que no pot baixar al carrer? On posem el punt mig? Perquè de vegades, per exemple, a l'hora de dinar, de sopar, Globo és com si ningú pogués anar a un restaurant o com si ningú pogués menjar a casa, que també és divertit, anar a un restaurant, anar a un bar, fer una volta i no anar tant al gimnàs. És una pregunta una mica d'abogado del diablo, però jo volia fer aquesta reflexió perquè sembla que tot s'ha de comprar per internet amb tota la despesa econòmica del cartró i totes aquestes bosses de Globo, de Libero, vull dir que fa una mica de tristesa pensar que ningú més sortirà al carrer a comprar. Jo crec que ja ha quedat clar, no? Gràcies.
Thank you for the question. I suppose that the internet has kind of impacted the way that we do everything, the way that we consume food or like the way that we order things. I'm hoping that presentations like this and general kind of, education about platforms and like what's going on and kind of some of the things that you don't quite see when you think about platforms. We often focus on the convenience offered by platforms and then forget about some of the costs and risks associated with it, some of the who's bearing them. So that's kind of, I hope, will be the takeaway, part of the takeaway from this, and like maybe other people talking about the platforms that you're referring to, which is Amazon, and some of the harms that Amazon workers also face in their work, and the environmental impacts of Amazon and as well any other digital technologies. So as we all learn more about that, hopefully we can all become more responsible consumers and residents.
Okay, thanks. Congrats on a really great project and a very nice presentation. So I have 3 comments. The first is I would like to push a little into knowing like why are you interested in the perspective of the workers, of the consumers, and of the policymakers? Because I mean, doing all this work, it would be easy to do survey research on their perspective on what people have already talked about, and especially on the trade-offs that the workers are willing to take. Because this will inform in which part of the regulation is probably not problematic for them, even if it's not according to the working standards. And in terms of the regulators, I think of course the policy making and the definition of the rules is very important. But I mean, trying to think about identify where the problems of enforcing this regulation would be really interesting, because people probably speak about algorithms, but all this internationalization and all this dealing with informal labor markets. I think this is really important. Like trying to understand that, like this points in which it is that regulation will not be enough. That the problem will be in enforcing, and this will probably could also be understood by looking at the workers' perspectives of what they will be doing if they were not on the platforms, because probably they would be in precarious jobs in informal markets, especially in the global south. So probably that's really interesting. And the last point is on the mechanisms, because I think that's also a fascinating area of research. You show all the impacts and you mention some of the actions you do. But if I would believe this would be very interesting if you talk a little more into detail of how this actually happens. Like, I mean, I understood you're lobbying policymakers directly with technical information and with petitioning, but also it's also nice to see if you're also making like a public opinion aware about this, who is internalizing the cost of this precarity I mean, like getting something to bring my food for €2. I'm being responsible or doing the Amazon shopping every day. I'm being responsible for these types of markets and problems. So, I mean, understanding which mechanisms work and how they do in different contexts will also be really, really interesting. So, thanks a lot.
Thank you. Let me think. I'll go through your comments one by one. In terms of the workers' views about possible regulations or the minimum standards, I think this is kind of the way that the whole project has been designed, is to kind of seek feedback from workers and unions along the way. Part of the research process also involves randomly kind of identifying workers to speak with, and when we talk to them about this, we also ask them, do you agree with this being part of like our framework? Do you have any like questions or feedback on all of the questions that we're asking? Is one of them not relevant, or is something else relevant that we're not thinking about? So there's a few different channels that we have to try and seek feedback from workers on these basic principles that we've got. A lot of these basic principles, I should mention, are also, you will find their equivalent in the ILO's decent work agenda. These are not new, novel things. A lot of them are like minimum wage and, protect workers from physical risks. These are things that we basically have already kind of ratified at the International Labour Organization level in a lot of different ways. So we're just sort of extending them to be cognizant of the risks that are specifically found in the platform economy, and not inventing anything from scratch. With respect to regulation and how we go about doing this and whether we do public opinions, I think this is part of it. And we do have a lot of different ways that we showcase our work and to try and like seek feedback from people like you and the public more generally. We try and create outputs for consumers as well. I just want to emphasize that the point of this is I don't want anybody to take away that it's any individual person's responsibility to change their habits necessarily. It's more we as individuals are not as powerful as to completely change the way that the platform economy is working, the injustices that we found. It's something that needs to happen at a regulatory level, at the platforms levels. And yes, we all have the voice in talking about it and changing, setting the discourse and pushing that envelope. But at the same time, you don't, I don't know, often people are like, should I not be using these platforms? But this has become, these platforms are occupying an infrastructural role in our societies increasingly, and it would be very hard to avoid them altogether. We can do what we can do as individuals. We can try to tip workers. We can be nice to them. We can, I don't know, the things that are within our reach, let's do them. But at the same time, it's not our individual responsibility to change our behavior because of this. Let's lobby our policymakers and let's do whatever we can, but we can't individually change anything. What alternatives if no platforms? I'm definitely not advocating that there should not be platforms. I think we're advocating that there should be some basic minimum labor standards at platforms. You're definitely right that even with these standards, they might not fly in places like, in places where there are not minimum labor standards in other non-platform sectors of the economy. So it doesn't quite make sense for, to have places where we don't have any sort of decent work standards, and then but the platform economy is set to a higher threshold. It doesn't quite make sense. But I think the point is to try and lift up all types of work across the board to ensure that there are at least some minimum protections. We're not going above the board. We're not going over and above to try and say that, all companies should now be owned by workers, which it would be great if it were, but that's not the basic that I'm talking about. I hope I touched on everything that you said.
There's another one here.
Hi, thanks. Let me ask in Spanish, so it would be easier for me, because I have too many questions and I don't want to extend myself. 2 questions or 3 questions. I was wondering, me preguntaba, ¿cómo luce, cómo es el historial laboral? Yeah. ¿Cómo es el historial laboral de alguien que trabaja en plataformas? ¿Se parece más a alguien que trabaja siempre en negro o está a medio camino del historial laboral de alguien que ha trabajado toda su vida con contratos? Porque estoy pensando en, por ejemplo, un joven que comienza a trabajar ahora en Deliveroo y trabaja ahí durante 4 años y cuando vaya a buscar otro trabajo, ¿cuáles son sus referencias? O sea, ¿qué presenta como historial laboral? Es una pregunta que me ha venido. La segunda pregunta que tendría es, habéis hecho muchas entrevistas con trabajadores de plataforma. ¿Alguien os ha contado qué es lo que se siente cuando uno es desactivado de una plataforma? Porque creo que es un sentimiento nuevo, diferente de ser despedido de una compañía. Y la tercera pregunta que tenía es, has mencionado que no es solo una cuestión tecnológica, la economía de plataforma es una cuestión política y económica. Y un poco haciendo referencia a lo que decía Luis, si a mí no se me paga por el tiempo que no estoy estrictamente trabajando, tener a una persona 16 horas disponible y pagarle por media hora de trabajo se aproxima mucho a tener un esclavo en casa. Lo que pasa es que ya ni siquiera lo tienes en casa. Es decir, nos está aproximando mucho a una forma muy moderna de esclavitud en la cual ni siquiera eres responsable de tus propios esclavos. Es decir, yo necesito a alguien que me traiga la compra en 10 minutos a casa y le voy a pagar por estos 10 minutos de trabajo, pero ni siquiera le pago a él, pago a alguien que se queda con parte de su salario. Es decir, la economía de plataforma es una forma hipermoderna de esclavitud.
Thank you for the questions. In terms of the labor histories of the people who work in the platform economy, there's obviously a huge diversity of different types of people who work here. Sometimes it's people who've been out of the job market for a while and therefore it's hard to find references, it's hard to find an easy transition back into traditional waged employment. And therefore, this is a kind of more accessible entry back into earnings. Sometimes it's, in a lot of cases, there's a disproportionate group of workers is migrant workers who've come into the country and therefore have maybe language barriers to entering traditional employment, or who are unable to basically access the formal qualifications that companies would look for. This is just an easier barrier. There's lower barrier to entry in this. But then there's also people who are maybe like, I think the way that the platform companies tend to conceive of like their worker, they say, oh, it's usually just a student who's earning money for 2-3 hours at the end of the day after they're done with their studies. But that is a bit of a misconception. There's definitely people like that, like not to say that there aren't part-time workers, there are part-time workers, but a lot of people do rely heavily on platform work for their earnings. So I do want to just emphasize that while there are definitely part-time workers, there's also people, on the other hand, who like work from morning to night on these platforms. Yeah, but so I guess it's quite hard to generalize and kind of identify labor histories. Everybody has quite unique ways that they end up in this work. Some people actually leave their jobs to start working, especially like in India, where I'm from. There's a lot of people who at the beginning, when these platforms were still quite new, it promised a lot of money. Like there was a lot higher than in like even low-level kind of bank jobs, for instance. This promised more money as long as you got a car, and the platforms showed you all this math of like you can pay it off in so and so months, and like it's a very kind of convincing pitch, basically. So a lot of people actually left jobs to try and like find work in the platform economy, but things changed quite rapidly. Like after a year, 2 years, the bonuses dropped, the earnings dropped, and people there's a lot of dependency that people end up having, because if you buy a car on lease payments that you have to make monthly regardless of however much you're earning, then you have to be there and work longer and longer hours until you make the money that you need to make this payment to the car. You don't have time really to look for another job, So lots of dependencies get created. I think once you do start working, in the last few years, there's been like the amount of earnings that people have made on average has just like really gone down. So now more so, that's less the case, that people are leaving their jobs to come work for this maybe, but yeah. I totally agree with you. I personally don't have the experience of having been deactivated, but I agree with you. It sounds like a really dehumanizing experience that you just get an email, or like the app just gives you a notification that you'd no longer have a job or whatever. And often there's no like due process after that. Like if you get deactivated, you lose access to the app. Like you can't log back in. So, but all of the communication channels through which you can communicate with the platform to ask why or appeal the decision are in the app. So if you can't get back in, what are you going to do? So like people have to go and stand in line at the offices and hope that somebody will the person at the desk will give them an ear or whatever, So I agree. It sounds like a terrible process, which is, people therefore should have, this is kind of part of the fair management principle, is that there needs to be reason given, there needs to be an appeals process, even if you've lost access to the app. Just ways to try and create some more accountability for this. This is not just like, you can't just push a button and tell somebody to, go find another job. Just, if you're going to do that, you need to give them some notice, give them a reason, and so on. Modern slavery and whether this is like that. I don't know how to answer that question. I think I am careful to not necessarily use the concept and framework of slavery when it is not applicable. Of course, people are still earning their livelihoods here. It's paid work, if unpaid sometimes, but overall, people are earning money. They're in charge of their own time. People actually find this to be more flexible than other kinds of work where you have to talk to your boss every day or see their boss every day. So I think in some ways, definitely not. And I think I'm a bit careful in using the word slavery.
We have one more question here and another one.
Well, good afternoon. Also, thanks a lot for the presentation. Really interesting. A couple of questions. One, I am not sure, maybe you explain. One is, when you make the ranking for the different platforms, if, for instance, a platform have a very bad ranking, they have the opportunity to be requalified after a period of time or not, if they make change, or this ranking is definitive, is the first question. Second, you show us the project, really amazing and interesting. You show also that you have different sources of fundings. Until when you are going to have these fundings? The project is going to have continuity or not? If it's the case, what is the idea? To convert to a label of social responsibility, but in this case of fair platform rate, or is the idea to continue with this initiative? These are my questions. Thanks a lot.
We are approaching to our end, so we can collect the second question from the floor here, and then you can answer all of them. I don't know if the audience that are online as well, if you have questions, you can send as well. We are over time, so people are saying to me that we are over time. So last question, please.
Buenas tardes, muchas gracias por la intervención. Ha sido muy interesante, ¿no? El proyecto es muy interesante. Haré dos preguntas y me extenderé poco. En primer lugar, ¿cuál es el papel que cree usted que pueden tener los sindicatos en el futuro, ¿no? De la misma manera que fue un papel de liberación, de alguna manera, de unas condiciones laborales en un momento de la historia, ¿cree que están preparados para liderar de alguna manera otro movimiento de recuperación de derechos, además de participar en la plataforma, en el proyecto Firework? ¿Qué papel cree que pueden tener en los distintos países en esta economía de plataformas? Y en segundo lugar, y en cuanto hablábamos también hablaba usted de las plataformas en la nube, ¿hasta qué punto los países del norte global están dispuestos, además de tener la sede de estos países, están dispuestos también a aplicarles las medidas de protección laboral o de condiciones laborales a estos trabajadores cuando son quienes tienen la sede social, ¿no? Nos ha puesto el ejemplo de Sudáfrica y de las sedes territoriales, como no se hacen cargo, ¿no? Nada más que de tareas más bien administrativas. ¿Hasta qué punto los gobiernos, además, y estoy pensando particularmente en la Unión Europea, deberían exigir esa responsabilidad a las empresas por tener la sede social? ¿O van a seguir estando exentas, igual que están también del pago de muchas veces de los impuestos y demás? Estoy pensando en lugares como Irlanda o como Bélgica, ¿no? Que tienen la sede social de muchas de estas empresas, pero no la sede responsable, ¿no? ¿Hasta qué punto los gobiernos deberían empezar, y la Unión Europea, a aplicar unas políticas de exigencia de responsabilidad? Gracias.
Thank you. All excellent questions. In terms of the platform ranking, I'll start with the questions first. In terms of the platform rankings, they're valid for 1 year, and then we redo the scoring the next year. And throughout the year, we actually do engage with the platforms, telling them their provisional score with the evidence that we have, telling them what changes they can make with each of the points that they haven't gotten, inviting them to make those changes and resubmit evidence, and then telling them, and then finally we have the final score. So there's a lot of opportunities for platforms to get engaged, definitely, and it's a yearly process. Sustainability of fair work, that's also a great question. It's something that we're grappling with constantly. A lot of our funding has come from research bodies and research funding and development funding from the German government. The German government has renewed our grants for the last few years, which is actually the majority of our funding. And we have also established a secretariat in Berlin, so I'm hoping that that's an indication of a few more years of continuity. And however, it's a really good question and that we're grappling with. It's not something I have an easy answer to, unfortunately. Coming to the next question about the role of trade unions and whether they're equipped to handle the challenges. I, for one, would say there's a very important role for them to be playing, and they're more and more very equipped to handle the challenges. This has become a very important field in terms of politics around work. And in fact, new unions are coming up in many different contexts, specifically to deal with platform work. So, for example, in Barcelona, Riders por Derechos is food delivery riders collective who've been thinking about this. CCOO has also been has commissioned the Fair Work research about this to try and increase public education and to try and understand more about the platform economy. And unions in the UK have contested platforms that have gone all the way up to the Supreme Court and received favorable rulings. Everywhere in the world, there's a union who's taking up this work. It's a challenge. It's like a different kind of work. There is no factory floor for people to go and organize. You know, people are dispersed all over the city. People are dispersed behind their screens at home. It's hard to organize these workers, but people are aware of these challenges, and I think that there's hope to be had in some of the wins that recently have come about, some of the solidarity that we are seeing across countries and across sectors. So I'm hopeful. And yeah. Then the last question about the accountability of the global North governments. That's a really excellent question. I think that the ILO has been calling for kind of collaborative multinational regulation on this issue, on both cloud work and platform work companies. And we've seen this before, like, I mean, with the garment industry, multinational corporations, we've seen kind of how different bodies and activists in different places have created ways to put pressure on governments in the global north to try and take accountability. It's not been perfect and it's not been fully successful, but there's definitely been pathways and mechanisms that can be replicated and learned from other like global value chains discourses in other sectors. So the ILO is actually already calling for trying to set kind of a multinational agenda about this. So hopefully that's something that we will see in the next few years. I haven't personally come across any examples of America where a lot of these companies are headquartered, putting conditions on these companies to change their labor practices in other countries, nor even in their own country. But I'm hoping that, well, there's a lot of debates happening about what's happening in America, but it's not something where you see pressure about labor practices in other places. But as the debate sort of clarifies as it's happening, and more countries like Spain, like the EU, are all taking up regulations in favor of platform workers, and this becomes more of an uncontestable truth, and the ILO does its work, then I'm hoping that the global north countries will have to also respond to pressure from their citizens to regulate what's happening outside of their borders. Yeah.
So thank you, Srujana, for this insightful conference. Moltes gràcies a tothom que ha vingut. També moltes gràcies a l'Observatori Social, de la Caixa, de la Fundació La Caixa, per donar-nos l'oportunitat de pensar aquestes coses que són la realitat de la nostra vida. Llavors també agraeixo al professor Santiago Giraldo per l'organització i comentar-vos que aquest cicle continua, que entreu a la pàgina de la Fundació La Caixa i de l'Observatori, que inscriviu-vos al newsletter per rebre la informació dels propers esdeveniments. Moltíssimes gràcies i fins a la propera.